Hello, everybody. Sorry to get you up so bright and early, but hopefully we'll keep this talk moving. Lots of good images, and I'm gonna fall off. No. And also, we'll leave some time for question and answers at the end. Again, I'm Audrey Tepper, and I'm a historical architect with the National Park Service's Technical Preservation Services branch in Washington, D.C. And my talk today concerns building codes, and although I'm trained as an architect, and although Natasha said I was an expert, I don't really consider myself an expert in codes, but I have learned a bit, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. My main responsibility in my office, as Natasha referenced, is the review of projects for the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program. How many are familiar with buildings, historic buildings receiving tax credits and the process? Quite a few of you. And how many of you are familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are really the guiding principles behind sensitive preservation in this country? And that's pretty much what my talk is geared towards. It's how you can upgrade a building, make it safe, and meet preservation guidelines. And some of the examples that I'll use are, it's pretty obvious when buildings do not meet the guidelines, but it's all trying to figure out how to make buildings safe and be a little bit creative in the process to come up with solutions that are not going to ruin the buildings and their integrity. Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, which is the guidelines that we review tax credit projects, and are the most flexible guidelines that are used throughout the country in many different applications, really require you to retain the character of a building and the integrity of a building, to not destroy it in the process if you're going to be making changes to the building. And also, when you make changes, such as for accessibility, adding solar panels, adding any kind of change inside or outside a building, you kind of have to do it, put on a different cap than you would have for new construction to retain those sort of qualities that make historic buildings so special. Face it, all buildings must be safe, including historic buildings, and of course the challenge is producing safe buildings without ruining their integrity in the process. And sometimes that's easier said than done, but with the right project team, the owner of a building who's really cares about their building and is willing to work with you, architects who understand the Secretary of the Interior standards, and engineers who are able to kind of think outside the box, you can definitely meet with success, and we have so many success stories out there with good solutions. And to illustrate how historic buildings can be code compliant and retain their characters as per the standards, I'll show you all kinds of examples. And before I get to kind of the fun stuff, I thought I would start by giving you some background on the codes that are commonly used in this country today. And I have to apologize, I'm not going to deal with energy codes. I'm going to deal with fire and life safety codes. Energy codes are a whole different animal. I know they're very important in Minnesota, but that's kind of not the direction I'm taking with this particular talk. Get situated here. So this citation is in the regulations governing the federal tax incentives program, and in essence it states that the standards trump all other regulations and codes, but this would never pass muster. You can't have an unsafe building. That's very unrealistic. So again, the challenge is to figure out solutions that work with the standards but keep everybody nice and safe in the event of an emergency. Getting sort of into some of the background, many years back in the dark ages, when I got out of architecture school, there were several different building codes used throughout the United States, which made things a bit confusing if you did projects in different locations. There was BOCA on the East Coast, Standard Building Code in the South, and the Uniform Building Code on the West Coast and here in the Midwest. In 1994, in an attempt to make things more consistent nationally, the International Codes Council, or ICC, was formed. In 2000, the very first version of the International Building Code, IBC, hit the streets, which unified the three previous code types. The IBC now, therefore, is used throughout the country. Of course, there are amendments to this code depending on where you are. If you're in a seismic area, there are going to be stricter requirements for upgrading your building for earthquakes, or if you're on a coastal area, there may be requirements for hurricanes and strong winds. And there remain areas of the United States that don't use IBC, and I don't really know how frequently that happens or what you guys use around here, but I'm thinking that a lot of people are using IBC, the International Building Code. That's pretty common. Ain't historic buildings always the poor stepchildren? When the first version of IBC came out, it really didn't include historic buildings. That soon changed, and the next version, which had some historic preservation professionals at the table, was the International Existing Building Code, aka IEBC, which was issued soon thereafter. Oops. To develop the IEBC, as I said, committees met nationally with preservation professionals involved. Before this time, several localities had their own breakout code sessions specific to historic buildings. And the sort of standout in this regard, and I work with the state of New Jersey, was the 1997 New Jersey Rehabilitation Subcode, which was one of the first and most comprehensive historic building codes to be successfully implemented. In fact, the New Jersey subcode was so successful that they really used that as a model and a basis for IEBC, the International Existing Building Code, and fully incorporated it into to the code as it exists today. Another important document that some may be familiar with was the HUD Guidelines on Fire Ratings of Archaic Materials and Assemblies. I remember using that many years back, and they incorporated that into an appendix to IEBC. As mentioned, there are other codes that supplement IBC and IEBC, and two of the most important are the National Fire Protection Agency's NFPA, and also, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. And Chapter 13 of NFPA mandates fire suppression systems for building types, including historic buildings, and we'll get into that in a moment. So what code do you use where? IBC and IEBC may overlap, but generally for historic buildings you get the most flexibility using IEBC. IBC can be used for all building types, new or old construction, but it's definitely more stringent when applied to historic buildings and a lot less forgiving. So IEBC, on the flip side, provides considerably more flexibility for historic buildings and can be used in three different ways. Number one, using the prescriptive method, which includes a list of prerequisites which must be met regardless. Number two, the work area method, which is based on the amount of work you undertake in a given building. And number three, and perhaps the most flexible of all, is Chapter 14's performance method, which allows you to quantify all life safety features you establish, assigning them an overall score. Some safety features of a historic building may not meet strict requirements for new construction, but there may be others that actually exceed the requirements for new construction. In this case, you would assign a lower score to a weaker feature and a higher score to a stronger feature, if that makes sense. And this is where the strictness of IBC overlaps with IEBC. Using the prescriptive method, you still have a baseline or a minimum set of requirements that must be met to keep a building safe. Because a baseline of safety is still met, the point system offered by IEBC's performance method allows for a safe building, but with a bit more flexibility in an attempt to keep the structure's integrity in place. So all three paths to using the IEBC have a similar clause when used for historic buildings. In essence, not every requirement is mandated for incorporation in a historic building, provided a code official doesn't consider it a distinct life safety hazard. Now this is an important term to remember, and it's something to avoid. You don't want to have a distinct life safety hazard, as it means the building is considered unsafe and will never pass muster. If an action does not constitute a distinct life safety hazard, then every once in a while a code official may offer a bit of flexibility, and this of course is at the official's prerogative, and I'll get into how that might be accomplished in a bit. So what do IBC and IEBC consider a historic building? Pretty straightforward. To be considered historic, a building must be listed in a local, state, or federal register, or have a preliminary determination of eligibility for listing in these registers. So that's my couple pictures of my son pacing through a building. I'm always taking pictures and annoying my children. Oh, mommy, just put the camera down for a change, they say. Anyway, I don't know who this gentleman is, and I did nab it from the web, but he sure looks like a code official, doesn't he? He's from the state of Maine. Just has that look about him. So Google code official, and this is what comes up. My advice here is to get to know your local code official. He or she will often be quite familiar with a specific property, as many historic buildings were involved with or underutilized or abandoned. And the official may be quite happy that somebody is finally trying to do something with them. They've sometimes been given to a city, such as in the case of a school that's no longer being used. And the city may not know what to do with them and may not be able to afford to do anything with them. So these buildings just sit unused. And also sometimes these buildings have had failed attempts because they have code challenges. So you would think that the code official would try to work with you to finally figure out what to do to bring these buildings into compliance. So the end result is that code officials should embrace new uses for buildings they see as thorns in their side or liabilities. You can learn a whole lot from code officials who hopefully come from cities with strong preservation backing, because it's always easier to get our jobs done if you get support locally. And sometimes, you know, well, let's see, lost track here, but really, and not to be outdone, you can learn a lot from the code official, and the code official can learn a whole lot from you as well. Sometimes, you know, in my dealings, you know, they don't sort of understand sometimes what we feel are really character-defining features of a historic building. So you can learn from them and they can learn from you. But certainly when you're working with a code official, they have the final say, so you really must be conciliatory. Hopefully you have a decent point total with your IEBC Chapter 14 performance method, and you're nearly there, but not quite. What a licensed architect or a registered design professional can do is write something called a request for code modification, which is generally a 3 or 4 page letter that outlines the conditions. It must be very upfront, so if there are any deficiencies or things you're trying to solve, you can't hide anything from the code official. You've got to be, you know, quite transparent. This might be undertaken if a code requirement, you know, if a code action sort of compromises the integrity of a historic building too greatly. If there is a deficiency, it cannot be a, you know, tremendously big one that does constitute that dreaded distinct life safety hazard that I referenced before. And remember that what you're asking is so risky that everybody, including the owner and the architect, are liable. Perhaps this is not the path to take. The request should be reasonable and not ask for too much. If approved, the request for code modification acts as a legal document which releases the code official from any liability. An example of this is if a travel path inside a building to a safe means of egress or to an exit is a bit too long, and we're talking only a few feet, you may want to trade a better than new condition for this slight deficiency. So, okay, what am I doing here? There we go, back on track. So there are several important questions to ask before you get going. So you're now best buddies with your code official, and you're trying to tackle a project with lots of code challenges. Don't just settle for an owner or an architect saying it can't be done because it doesn't meet code. You really need to ask for specifics. Perhaps the most important thing to do when you have a code situation that doesn't meet the Secretary's standards is ask the project team if there's another creative way of doing things that won't adversely impact the integrity of the building in the process and still keep the occupants safe. That seems pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised. There will hopefully be that golden solution if you sort of try and try again. Know what codes are being used and make sure they're being used to the fullest. And ask for exact code citations. Don't just take their word for it. Where in the code does it say this? Because so many times people will just say, oh, it doesn't meet code. It's like, well, you know, substantiate that. What does that mean? And certainly make sure that all avenues have been followed with the code official. And if you're not terribly far apart, do seek a request for code modification to make up the difference. So the following is a list of common code challenges, and there's of course no silver bullet to any of these. But I tried to take a stab at coming up with things that we see in reviewing tax credit projects that are pretty seen pretty often. There are a few things to keep in mind. The taller the building, the more code requirements for fire and life safety. Also, when people are active, such as in an office or in a store, there are fewer overall requirements because it's a lot easier to get people who are up and alert out of a building as opposed to if you have residential component to the building, because getting sleepy people out of a building is much more of a challenge. So if you have residential in the building, there are going to be more code requirements. Also, two separate and distinct means of egress must be provided, so continuous and unobstructed paths of travel to safe places must be included. So first on my list is fire suppression. I nabbed this image from an article on fire suppression in Building Conservation, which is a British magazine, and it's of the dome of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And for the life of me, I cannot tell where they've hidden the sprinkler heads. That's a good thing because it does take, are they there? I'm not entirely sure, but they are hidden somewhere, and they've done it very skillfully on such an important building. So adding an NFPA, National Fire Protection Agency, Chapter 13 fully compliant sprinkler system into a building accomplishes much in terms of life safety requirements. So expensive as they are, they're involved and quite expensive, you get your biggest bang for your buck in terms of code compliance, with many discrepancies disappearing once one is installed, and a steep rise in the points achieved should you use the performance method in IEBC. As an aside, there's often a battle with owners and contractors who want to lessen their construction costs by installing a less compliant sprinkler system, namely a 13R system as opposed to a full 13 system. 13R uses plastic piping, and there's a difference in the way they're pressurized, and there's also a huge difference in their level of compliance. So you may be saving money initially, but then have all of these headaches with these deficiencies later on because you've used the less compliant system. And this is something that we want to avoid. The Secretary's standards require keeping the character of a building, and this, I'm not sure what this building was originally, but we talk about it being a finished building, meaning that it has plaster on the walls, and it's got, maybe marble wainscoting, or, as opposed to, say, an industrial building or a warehouse, which might have had exposed piping and the like. So here, they probably have turned this into residential, and they put the waste lines in there and the sprinkler lines, and it's really kind of an unattractive appearance for this building and something that we would like to avoid. So with the sprinkler system, it is a bit tricky because there are three basic components that you kind of need to tuck away. You've got piping for the water supply, piping to distribute the water, and sprinkler heads. And it may also need room for a water storage tank and a water pump. Installing these systems sensitively is crucial, as a jumble of exposed piping in a finished interior space can adversely affect the character in a really big way. A more sensitive installation is this former school in Baltimore, Maryland, where, you can see the sprinkler heads, but they're not kind of in your face, and they've been painted the same color as the walls. And of course, a sprinkler system is sort of a necessary evil. You want to have your building safe, but again, the challenge is to install it in the most sort of carefully thought out way possible, and I think they were pretty successmal here. And that this school was converted into residential. Sometimes you have to get really creative. This is a very elegant apartment building in Washington, D.C. It was built in 1927, and the porte cochere, little entry to the building has actually a carved, the face of Lindbergh, which I think, put a little false history in there, and it certainly marks this building in 1927, when Lindbergh was at his heyday. But the interior of the building, as you can see, is very elegant. This is the lobby, and it has a coffered ceiling, and it's really a lovely space that was kind of brought back to life when it was rehabilitated. But it was a real challenge to try to get utilities in there. Where are you going to put sprinkler pipes and wiring and the like? And so what they actually did was they lowered the central beam down the center. And you can see where it's been lowered, but it's not, I can see it, but if you walked into that space, that's not what you would notice. You would notice the elegant ceiling. And they've tucked that little sprinkler head in there. Here in Minnesota, this was kind of a creative solution for the conversion of the F&M Bank in Minneapolis. It's a 1940s, early 40s banking hall with a very large 1960s addition wrapping around it. And it was, it's now a Westin Hotel, and there's a restaurant in the banking hall. And the challenge they had here was that they turned the former offices in that L addition into hotel rooms, but the building next door was so close that the code officials originally said they had to brick up the windows because they didn't want, in the event of a fire, they didn't want flames to spread from one building to the next. But they solved this by putting a sprinkler head right at the window head, and they were able to keep the windows open. Sometimes you have fire challenges on the exterior of buildings, and this is in Majestic Lake, Minnesota, where this very vulnerable Forest Service cottage was saved because you can see sprinklers on the outside of the cottage. I guess it must pump water from the lake, so that's, I think, a great example. Did I lose? I dropped a page here. There we go. So another challenge, and the next on my list, is the width of doors, stairways, and corridors. And they come up often in historic buildings, not quite meeting code, because historic buildings were never designed with our modern idea of what makes a property safe. And I seem to get my share of projects with skinny stairs. Here's a gentleman who is squeezing himself up these stairs. How wide do stairs have to be? It really depends on the number of people that will use them, the use of the building, and the presence of a sprinkler system. If a small number of people are using the stairs, the width varies from a minimum of 36 to 44 inches. If a significant number of people are using them, it's a fraction of an inch per person using the stair. The IEBC does make allowances for existing historic stairs due to the infeasibility of changing a stair in an existing building. These allowances kind of vary greatly based on the amount of work being done on a particular building, but there are, you'll be in a building that has an absolutely huge, wonderful grand stair, and that may not meet egress requirements, but you can kind of still use that stair provided you have means of egress elsewhere in the building. You do get these code challenges, and sometimes you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. This was a series of projects, little workers' houses or duplexes in southern New Jersey that I had several years back. And these were very modest little units, very tight, nothing fancy here. And you can see the original stairs here. I mean, they were so narrow, so steep, and I'm 5'3", so I didn't have any problem hitting my head at the top of the stairs, but anybody much taller than that would go upstairs and have to dock. So when these were rehabbed, the code officials were like, no way are these stairs compliant. So they're very, very tight little space, and they couldn't really add on to the exterior of the buildings. And so they did actually add a second set of stairs into the building, but they're very modest. They just are code compliant this time. And they kept the original stairs kind of behind a closet door, and they just used them for storage. So there was sort of a clue as to the history of the building and what happened originally, but they were able to put new stairs in there that worked. But that was kind of a tough call, because whatever you did was going to be a change to the interior. Here's my friend in his very narrow staircase again. This is a project in Northern Virginia. It's an old Episcopal church that was no longer being used as a church, and actually a really good new use was being proposed for this building, namely a recording studio. So they were using the chapel or whatever of the church for performances and had rehearsal spaces and the like, and it really worked quite well. The building, if you can see in the floor plan, there were two issues here. Number one, those stairs inside were very, very narrow, and they did not need work as a means of egress. So they actually, in the rear of the building, this is the rear of the building, I don't have a picture of the new stair in place, but they added a new stair, very simple exterior stair. I think a window was converted to a door, but it was at the rear of the property, and that worked, and that solved the egress problem. The issue with these stairs is that functionally, on the interior, however they were using this building, they really needed that little set of stairs because they needed to bring equipment back and forth when they were doing performances. And so what they actually did to sort of widen the stair, to not take out that historic stair, which had kind of a simple but nice little board railing, is that they hinged it. So if they bring equipment back and forth, they just kind of put this thing down and then they put it back in place. And so sometimes people are pretty creative in what they do, and they were able to keep that stair, which was part of the original function of the building, get their means of egress with a simple new solution out the back. Moving on to transoms and other glazing. This again is where a lot of requirements when buildings are converted to residential, and in tax credit projects we see a lot of that. We see a lot of old schools, we see a lot of, I don't know the majority of our projects, but quite a bit deal with residential reuse. And one of the things that you can't have is glass facing a public corridor. Glass, if it's in the event of a fire, it will crack, and you can and both smoke and flames will transfer into apartment units. So you do need fire separation between public corridors and units on the other side. And this is kind of the configuration that people are sort of very familiar with in mid to late 19th century buildings, and really throughout the 19th century. You have a door, and you would have a glass transom above that was used for ventilation and for light. And the solution here is to sort of add the fire separation on the unit side of the corridor, and leave the corridor largely intact, so that, yeah, there is a change because you no longer can see through up here, but you can put drywall on the other side, get your fire separation, and not change the character of that corridor too greatly. And actually, I was looking at the doors in this building, which are very similar to this example. If you just turn around, you can see doors like this, sort of French doors. This was a school in Kansas that was converted to residential. And instead of taking out those lovely sort of French doors, they just inserted another fire-rated door on the interior. So now you get into your unit, you just open one and then open another door. And it's a little bit strange, I suppose, if you're opening two doors, but it was actually quite a good solution. And you can see when we try to keep the character of the building, these residential units kept the chalkboards in the apartment units, which I think worked quite well. Let me zip ahead here a little bit. These are the Sorrento apartments in the Adams-Morgan neighborhood of Washington, D.C., which was recently rehabbed into affordable housing. And this is a truly remarkable transformation of a great-looking building. I used to live around the corner from this, and you just never noticed this building because it was kind of hidden under layer after layer of sort of gloppy yellow paint. And they stripped the paint away, and there was beautiful brick patterns, and they restored the window configurations. It was such a dramatic before and after. But the interior of this building is really pretty modest. The only real ornamentation inside are some existing sort of mosaic tile floors and an open stair in the main lobby. And this stair rises only 2 floors before it's historically enclosed. Initially, code officials wanted them to fully enclose that stair going from the 1st to 2nd floor. But with further back and forth, the following solution was implemented, which most definitely meets the standards. What they did was insert a small section of glass here, which is called a fire curtain, and this allowed the 2 runs of the primary stair to remain open. And the reason for this is that in the event of a fire, open stairs act like a chimney, allowing smoke to rise. As smoke rises, it also dissipates, and so much so that it might not be concentrated enough at the base of the stair to set off a smoke detector or a sprinkler head. By adding this piece of glass, in the event of a fire with smoke, the smoke will not rise as quickly and will stay at a denser concentration, dense enough so an alarm will sound or a sprinkler head will activate. So there's a sprinkler head, and although you probably can't see it, there's a smoke detector somewhere nearby. So that solution, yeah, it's a little bit of a change, but it actually allowed these stairs to remain open. So moving on to the heights of openings and stair guards. In historic buildings, you will often notice that stair rails are too low. So guardrails for egress to meet current code need to be 42 inches high. Railings in residences 34 to 36 inches high, and you also have to meet the baby head rule, which is that a sphere of 4 inches cannot pass through an opening in the railing, so a child cannot get their head stuck in a railing. Several years back, I wrote some guidance on, we have a series called Interpreting the Standards, which is sort of subject-specific guidance on different preservation-related issues. And I did this one on modifying historic railings to meet code, and there's a link in your handout there. This is kind of what we're trying to avoid. Here we've got this sort of elegant, hardwood railing, and yeah, it now meets code, but it also adds a very lovely in-house laundry rack or something else. You can just hang your junk from there. So there's got to be a more sensitive solution to that. Again, back to Minnesota, I thought this was a particularly successful adaptation of a railing at the Minneapolis Brewing Company brew house, which is where Grain Belt beer was brewed. And there's a central atrium in this space, which is very elegant. It's sort of wrought iron and cast iron. And they just added a little bit of an extension, a little bit of a circle, a little bit of ornamentation, which seems to fit with all the other curlicues that are happening in this space. But they got their code compliant, both stair rail and rail around the atrium. But you have to take your cues from the type of building that you have. If you're a very stripped down, simple building, then adding ornamentation might not be appropriate. This is, I was at a wedding at the Harvard Club, and instead of looking at the loving couple, I was taking pictures of good safety solutions, and they were able to add a very simple railing along this fairly wide rail, and I'm not sure whether code mandated that or whether they just watched people, that they had trouble with the main railing, but again, a very simple solution. Back to the F&M Bank in Minneapolis, as I had said, the banking hall has a restaurant in it now, and there's a mezzanine level, and the mezzanine is here. And the mezzanine level has a different function than the restaurant, and there were 2 things that were happening here. They had a simple metal rail that was too short, so they were going to have to adapt the rail, but they also needed to separate the function of the building, so they added sort of structural glass in there, which took care of both the change in function and the too short railing. But this just illustrates that sometimes glass works very well because you still understand the original function, that there was an open mezzanine up there, but there is more privacy for that other function. This is an old former auto showroom in Richmond, Virginia. A very different kind of railing, kind of a colonial revival building with a little bit of a fat top rail. But they just inserted a little metal channel there and a little glass, and you can sort of stand below and look up, and that glass just disappears, so you really see the historic railing. And if you look closely enough, you can see that extra glass. Sometimes you have railings on the exterior of buildings. This was a hotel that wanted to add a roof deck, and we have, very often you need a safety rail so people don't tumble over. And the thing to remember here is that they set the rail back because we don't want new features on the top of a building that are going to be very, very distracting, because that alters the building's character. So they set the railing back, and then they used glass once again, and if you're standing below looking up, you don't see that railing at all. A little more industrial application. This was a brewery in Baltimore where there were panoramic views of the city, so a lot of people want to be up on that roof. And they used a more sort of industrial looking rail, which they did put on the perimeter of the building, but they slanted it. So if you're on the ground looking up, you can't see it, but you do have the safety requirements that you need when you're up there. Accessibility. Buildings have to be accessible, and again, the challenge is to make them accessible, but not ruin a building's integrity too greatly in the process. So I don't know how many of you were in my Main Street talk yesterday. Some of these slides I used for that as well, so sorry if you have to hear about these twice. But the idea is to place a ramp and make a building accessible without ruining its integrity in the process. I'm starting to sound like a broken record. But this building has this ramp. Yeah, the building's accessible, but you can barely see the building or the ground floor of this building in the process. So you'd like to think that you could do it more sensibly. This was an example. It's a National Historic Landmark on Capitol Hill in Washington, where it's a house museum for the women's suffrage movement. And it has a backyard that is used for all kinds of receptions and weddings and the like. And there were two problems. The house museum had to be accessible and the backyard had to be accessible. And so I was brought on board as an advisor, and this was the first proposal. It has a side elevation, which is, that's secondary to the primary elevation, but still highly visible and heavy traffic. And this building in the back is this Hart Senate office building, so this is really like in the, excuse the expression, the heart of Capitol Hill. So this is what they wanted to do first, this huge ramp. There was a big grade change there, so they had to make this huge ramp that just completely, took over that side elevation. And it only solved one of the two problems. It only got you to the backyard, and the caterers could bring their food up there, but the house museum was still inaccessible. They talked about putting an elevator on the back of this National Historic Landmark, which was hardly ideal. And at the time, the director of the museum envisioned that there would be exhibits on all floors. So the whole building had to be accessible. There was a change in guard, and a new executive director took over, and she had a background in preservation, and she was determined to tackle this accessibility issue in a sensitive way, which was music to my ears, certainly. What they ended up doing was kind of in three different parts, and sort of bear with me as I walk you through. Gone is that hellacious ramp that snaked on the side elevation, but there was a set of sort of modern brick stairs at the very far end of the building, right there. And there was a little strip of land here that had already been disturbed to build those stairs, so there was no archaeological resources below. And they put in a little lift in that slot. And that lift, which is sort of number one on my chart, got you to the backyard. And the backyard, there was a little bit of a grade change. So they put in some sensitive little brick sidewalks or pathways. And then at the rear of the house, which is number 3 here, they put yet another lift in the back of the house that had already had some alterations. And that took somebody, a wheelchair user, into a very nice parlor that was just off the main stair hall. The big change in all of this is that the executive director changed the interpretation of how they were going to exhibit the house and put all the most important exhibits on the first floor. So that was where you needed to go. And anything that was on the upper floors, which was a little more minor to telling the story that they wanted to tell, was they had video interpretation. So right off the bat, with a little bit of creative thinking, they we're able to make both the backyard and the house accessible without sort of destroying or having that huge ramp in the process. All kinds of products out there that can help you with accessibility. This is a church in Virginia that added a ramp on the side, and they kind of use similar materials on a very simple metal rail, and it takes you into the front of the church, pretty much where everybody else enters. Quite well done. And sometimes you can ramp on the interior of the building, or need to ramp on the interior of the building. This is the Mayflower Hotel, which is a rather Tony establishment in DC, and had kind of some elegant marble stairs here. And there were areas of the stair removed on either side, but in this particular building, once again, they were able to put some nice brass railings on the ramp, and it works quite well. So, going from accessibility to exits. The number, size, separation, and path from exits to public streets are extremely important safety features. And there are a series of common problems that we experience. But let me just take a step back and sort of define what egress means. You need to have a path to a safe means of egress. A means of egress is a term that defines the ability to safely exit a building in the event of a fire or another emergency situation. And it can be broken down into three distinct components. Number one, the safe, unobstructed path of travel to reach an exit. Number two, the exit itself, its location, its dimensions, its materials. And the area you reach once you get through the exit that leads you outside to safety. There are common problems that occur with exits and means of egress, and they are that you only have one stair in a building leading to an exit, and you need two in a building of a certain square footage to meet code. Having an exit that leads to an unsafe place, into an enclosed courtyard. It's great that you empty a building, you get out of the building into the outside, but if you're in an enclosed courtyard and the building is burning around you, well, it's not going to help you much. So you also have multiple exits that are too close together, leaving certain areas of the building without proper egress. And then you also have dead-end corridors, which I'll get to in a moment. And then there is the issue of having open stairs, which I'll also talk about. Now, requirements for exit doors depend on building occupancy, but generally they must be 36 inches wide. And this is the same requirement for getting a wheelchair through a building. So sometimes these things overlap and you get an accessible entrance and a safe entrance. I should say exit, not entrance. In residential applications, it is crucial to provide egress out of bedrooms where people sleep, and as we said, there are special requirements for residential uses. And you can often achieve this by exiting through a window that is large enough to climb through, and if a residence has a full sprinkler system, I believe it does not need windows in bedrooms for egress. Now, you may need windows in your bedroom to stay sane, but that's a different story. Sometimes you have fire escapes, and a lot of times these fire escapes are no longer used and they're kind of rickety, but this is a project that I had that had a very substantial fire escape that was still quite stable, and the code official let them reuse it. And as you can see, there are clear exits to the fire escapes, and in this sense they were able to reuse it, but you might want to check with your code official to see whether that would be the case where you live or with your project. Dead-end corridors. The definition of a dead-end corridor is a corridor that has no means of egress. Simple as that, although it's not very simple. But for example, if a corridor on the second floor leads down a hallway with rooms, but there is no stairwell present, you would consider this a dead-end corridor. Another example is if on the first floor of a building, a corridor leading to rooms is not connected to a stairwell or does not have clear access to an exterior exit, it's also considered a dead-end corridor. Furthermore, if stairs or an exterior exit are in the middle of corridors, everything extending beyond these corridors are also considered dead-end corridors. So here are a few examples. The issue in this apartment building is that the corridor is too long. You can see here. and there's no adequate fire separation. So what happened here is that they needed to add fire separation because it was sort of more than 20 feet. And it, in essence, sort of truncated that corridor, but very often you kind of have to do that. And one of the ways that, and I'll show you in a second, of providing fire separation by not kind of losing that visual of an extended corridor is make that fire separation transparent. Sometimes you can add a fully compliant NFPA Chapter 13 sprinkler system to increase the allowable path of travel, but I don't think that's a very common type of thing to happen. This is a building that, if you were to sort of characterize it, it's kind of got this knuckle-shaped corridor, and it has these little spoke corridors off of the main central corridor, the little sort of light blue up here. Those were considered dead-end corridors. And they actually sort of offered fire separation here and did sort of truncate the corridors, but the basic essence of that floor plan is still visible, even if you sort of closed off those smaller corridors. They're kind of secondary to the main corridor. So despite the changes, I think it works okay in this instance. Whoops, yeah, I knew there was something I needed. Those are the corridors that were dead-end corridors, and they were sort of made shorter in the final solution. This is a project in St. Paul on University Avenue that was as an old warehouse space that was converted to artists' live workspace. And often you combine means of egress with accessibility by building a stair tower or an elevator tower. And this is a very long building. It sort of extends almost the whole block. And they did build a stair tower at the end, and here's the front of the building. You can't see the new construction. And it's a pretty sizable stair tower or elevator tower there. They got their lobby in, but it works. It makes the building both accessible, adding a second means of egress, and the new construction works in this instance. Taking your cue from the style of a building, this is a former hotel in Kansas, kind of a square, boxy building, and here's a square, boxy stair tower at the rear. So it's not the most elegant thing, but it was a pretty stripped down building anyway. So moving on to fire separation. Let me flip through here. This is a two-story former school that has an H-shaped corridor, with a set of stairs on each end. So you've got a set of stairs here and a set of stairs there. And at first glance, it looks like this layout might meet code. There are two means of egress with unobstructed paths to exits. But the stairs are connected by this common corridor. And what happened is that you needed to add fire separation there. Since there's no separation of these spaces from fire and smoke, some separation was required. And this was achieved, as I said, by adding separation in those two locations. But one of the character-defining features of a school are these expansive, long corridors. And so to visually retain the volume of that continuous corridor, these new walls were glazed, aka left transparent, rather than made solid. And since this building was no more than 2 stories, the glazing in this instance did not have to be fire rated. And we'll see examples of larger buildings where fire rated glass was actually added, because the taller the building, the more requirements. So when I talk about sort of separation that is transparent, here are some examples of how you might get that fire separation, but visually you can still see down that corridor. If that was a solid partition, it would be something very different and really change that space dramatically. So moving on to a taller building, with buildings higher than 2 stories, stairs, which can act as chimneys for smoke in the event of a fire, must be separated from corridors with 2-hour rated partitions. So fire separation was required there. And also, this is an example of a primary stair in a 3-story building. And if you can see beyond the glass, the stair is really quite nice. And once again, there's a fairly heavy partitioning here, but it's transparent, so you can still see that stair beyond. The use of fire-rated glass in historic buildings is very effective because it offers adequate fire separation without obscuring details on the volumes of large spaces. But over the last 5 years or so, the ICC, the International Codes Council, has become stricter with the use of glass overall. And for example, there are a few places left where traditional wire safety glass, such as this, is allowed. Transparent ceramic glass is sometimes installed, but I don't think it's strong enough, except to be used in a few applications, and also it may offer less than an hour of fire separation. So the sort of fully compliant fire glass is comprised of 5 layers of fused glass with fully sealed joints and gaskets, so smoke can't get through. And it's pretty heavy material. It's really an extraordinary material because you can use it in lots of applications, but it is expensive. So I'm just putting a warning out there. So sometimes people cringe at the price. Very often in historic buildings, certainly I was giving a talk on Main Street buildings, common rehab concerns yesterday. You have buildings, this was taken in Faribault, a little coffee shop with a great pressed tin ceiling, which is really a wonderful sort of attribute to a building. And do we have a question in the back?
Yeah, just when you were saying enclosing, when you showed that picture of enclosing the staircase with that, the clear thing, was that needed to be done on every floor, or was that just on like on
it needed to be done on every floor. Yeah. So because you had, you can't let the smoke. So it's kind of a pricey solution, but it worked, and they got their tax credits. Anyway, so we talked about mixed-use buildings where you may have had a retail component down below. Actually, we haven't talked about mixed-use buildings, but in this case, a very common scenario is that you have, on a Main Street building, for example, you have a store below, and you often have apartments up above. And you need to get fire separation between the floors in this mixed use. People are sleeping up above, and you need additional fire separation. So what happens when you have a very lovely decorative pressed tin ceiling, what you really need to do is you have to take down the pressed tin ceiling, add the fire separation, repair the ceiling, and then put it back in place. That sounds like a whole lot of work, but we've seen it done over and over again. And sometimes your pressed tin ceiling is pretty damaged, but it's pretty forgiving, and it does come down easily if you're very, very careful, and you put it back in place with your fire separation, and it works. So I show this example because we see it done all the time to make buildings compliant. Another thing that, the code official will say, you need all this fire separation, and I've talked about retaining the character of buildings, and so here is this was an old paper mill in Massachusetts, and it had this sort of exposed structure, kind of that raw industrial feel on the interior. And they said, well, the code official said that we had to, with the new use, put all of this fire separation, so we just covered everything with wallboard. Well, I'll tell you, that don't look like the same space as that. You want to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, even when you put a new use in a building, you still want to understand that it's an industrial building. And yeah, you can tell from the interior, but you can no longer tell. You can tell from the exterior, but you can no longer tell from the interior. So you work around code challenges to try to keep as much of the historic appearance of the building as possible, even on the inside. This is a project I'm currently working on in New Jersey. It was an old building that manufactured wire rope, like for suspension bridges, sort of that wire cable. Really in rough shape. But these buildings have a lot of, they're strong. They were built to last. And so even though this building has been abandoned and is very, very moisture damaged, it's going to be rehabbed for apartments. And I think they're on the right track to doing good work here. But you can see again, the character of that building is the exposed columns and the wood joists and structural system up there. In this instance, they did not want to cover that industrial, the exposed structure. And they went to the code official and they said the floors on the upper, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze.
Two glass.
Okay, there, thank you. The floors on the upper levels were very, very deteriorated. I mean, they were gonna have to replace the floors anyway. There was no way that they could be kept. They were practically shredded. But what they did was take that, use that as an opportunity to put the fire separation on the floors, and then put a new wood floor that kind of matched the old on top of that. So the code official, I'm hoping, is going to let them keep all of that exposed below. And yet, you'll notice a newer floor up above, but it's slightly higher with that fire separation added from above. So we're waiting to hear whether the code official will buy the solution. A few other creative solutions that I just threw in here that don't always fit neatly into a category. It's another one of my New Jersey projects, a really sort of massive brick warehouse. And warehouse spaces often had sort of smaller windows that were high off the ground, and you wanted to be able to stack your wares on the interior. This was a warehouse. And you also, UV light was not ideal for whatever they were storing in there. It could affect that. So this was going to be converted to residential, and they wanted to lower every single window in this building. And as you can see, there's sort of this horizontal banding, and the last band on the bottom became the windowsill. It becomes the windowsill of the window. And this is what we started with here, with kind of little squarish windows, and this is what they wanted to do. This building was going to look very different with these long, skinny windows afterwards. So this did not make it and was denied for tax credits, and they were not interested in working with us. The tax credits are not a grant or an entitlement, they're a voluntary program, so it was the owner's choice if they didn't want to. If they could get local approval for what they wanted to do, they could do the project without the tax credits, then that was their choice. But a solution, a different solution, this was a building in Montana that wanted to do the same thing. It had smaller windows that were very high up off the ground, and they wanted to put apartments in it. And instead of lowering the windows, they actually raised the floor in the living room to meet the window. So actually kind of added an interesting design feature with, you stepped up to go to your living room, but it kept the exterior of the building intact in the process, which I think was much more successful than the last go around, or the last project I showed. This is the Winona High School in Winona, Minnesota, that was converted to housing several years back. Sometimes you have requirements for sound absorption in buildings. This school had really lovely terrazzo floors, and at the intersection of corridors there was little decorative elements. And this is something that we allow for sound absorption, and it gets cold in Minnesota winters, it probably keeps the corridors a little warmer as well. They put a carpet runner, but they kept the edges of the floors uncovered so that you could see the historic material below. And they didn't cover up where the corridors had the interesting decorative elements. And they lined the carpet with a little rubber edging so that it would lay flat and sort of made a little access into units. So it sure was nice to not have to cover that floor up entirely. And I'm not sure what category this goes into, but I just really like it as a creative solution. This is an old Quonset Hut in Virginia that was converted to housing, and it was very dark inside, so they were looking at ways to add light. And historically, it had these little sort of mushroom-shaped ventilators on the top, which had rusted out over time, but they sort of replicated these things, but made them into skylights. So maybe for green requirements, when you wanted to have a lot of daylighting, I thought that was a very nice solution. So that's my lowdown, my little dog and pony show here, which covered a lot of information relatively quickly. Again, there are many, many different code challenges. And just when I think I've seen it all, something else comes my way. But it really takes some creativity and some people who are not, I think engineers are very, very important, but sometimes they want the quickest, easiest solution. And for historic buildings, that often doesn't work without compromising in the process. So, you want to have a project team that's willing to to go the extra mile and work with code officials, and we see a lot of buildings throughout the entire country that are safely rehabbed, so there are very few times when we don't make it a habit eventually.